Okay, there you are.
Okay, we can see your slides now, but it's not on presentation mode.
Yeah, I'm looking for.
You go down to the end of the slides on your right. There will be a present. Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Okay.
Click on it. Selection. Excellent. Yeah.
And let me start by going straight away to the central theme of the topic, which is the the assertion that the pitfalls of the concept of gender equality in the Western models may be said to have arisen from its inability to benefit from a revealed scriptural guidance. That's my overall take of the issue. By that, we mean that the Western or secular model has got to rely entirely on human and societal notions of what constitute women's status, their rights and responsibilities, which can be anything other than absolute. This can be seen in the series of women equality movements, where its proponents have to come out with their own ideas, activities, and measures of gender equality or women's empowerment. So let's go to the first wave of feminism. It brings us to women's suffrage movement. Women's suffrage is the right of women to vote in elections. Beginning in the mid-19th century, aside from work being done by women for broad-based economic, political equality and for social reforms, women sought to change voting laws to allow them to vote. National and international organizations formed to coordinate efforts towards that objective, especially the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, founded in 1904 in Berlin, Germany, as well as for equal civil rights for women. So this was the first wave of obvious or clear first wave feminism in the West. We could say that. But what I want to cite here is the many instances occurred through the process where women were selectively given and stripped the right to vote. Yeah. So, for example, the first sovereign nation was Norway in the Kingdom of Hawaii, which originally had universal suffrage in 1840. But this was rescinded in the, you can see it, in 1852 and was subsequently annexed by the United States in 1898. And then we find that women who own property gain access to the right to vote in the Isle of Man in 1881, which means that if you are women but you don't own properties, then you don't have the right to vote. Most major Western powers extended voting rights to women during the interwar period, including Canada, Britain and Germany, Austria and the Netherlands, and the United States. But there were notable exceptions in Europe, such as in France, where women could not vote until 1944, and in Greece, 1952. Although since 1930, literate women were able to vote in the elections. And Switzerland where since 1971, women could vote at the federal level, and between 1959 and 1990, women got the right to vote at the local canton level. That was the situation. The voting rights for women changed from country to country. Some were given and some were rescinded. But then something happened. That was the First World War. And First World War changed the popular mood. Because the women's contribution to the war effort challenged the right of women's physical and mental inferiority, and made it more difficult to maintain that women were both by constitution and temperament unfit to vote. Because if they can contribute to the war effort, how can we assert that women are physically and mentally inferior to men, and therefore become the justification for denying them the right to vote? If women could work in munitions factories, for instance, which they did, it seemed both ungrateful and illogical to deny them a place in the voting booth. But the vote was much more than simply a reward for war work. The point was that women's participation in the war helped to dispel the fears that surrounded women's entry into the public arena. So the First World War changed the popular mood again, and women achieved a significant progress in terms of their voting right. Okay, that was one model of early women's equality movement in the West. And now we go to the second wave, which is the women's liberation movement, yeah, or the women's league. Okay. The WLM was a political alignment of women and feminist intellectualism that emerged in the late 1960s and continued in the 1980s, primarily in the industrialized nations of the Western world, which affected great change, political, intellectual, cultural, throughout the world. So the WLM branch of radical feminism, based in contemporary philosophy, comprised women of racially and culturally diverse backgrounds who proposed that economic, psychological, and social freedom were necessary for women to progress from being second-class citizens in their societies. So towards achieving the equality of women, the WLM questioned the cultural and legal validity of patriarchy and the practical validity of the social and sexual hierarchies used to control and limit the legal and physical independence of women in society. Women's liberationists proposed that sexism, legalized formal and informal sex-based discrimination predicated on the existence of the social construction of gender, was the principal political problem with the power dynamics of their societies. In general, the WLM proposed socio-economic change from the political left, rejected the idea that piecemeal equality within and according to social class would eliminate sexual discrimination against women, and fostered the tenets of humanism, especially the respect for human rights of all people. In the decades during which the women's liberation movement flourished, liberationists successfully changed how women were perceived in their cultures, redefined the social, economic, and the political roles of women in society, and transformed mainstream society. That we can say is the general achievement of the WLM model. But we can pinpoint some pitfalls of the WLM. First, for instance, After the intense period of fighting for women's suffrage, the common interest which united international feminists left the women's movement without a single focus upon which all could agree. Ideological differences between radicals and moderates led to a split and a period of de-radicalization, with the largest group of women's activists spearheading movements to educate women on their new responsibilities as voters. Organizations like the African National Congress Women's League, the Irish Housewives Association, the League of Women Voters, the Townswomen's Guilds, and the Women's Institutes supported women and tried to educate them on how to use their new rights to incorporate themselves into the established political system. Still, other organizations involved in the mass movement of women into the workforce during World War I and World War II, and their subsequent exit at the end of the war with concerted officials okay. Okay, I missed that portion. Okay, let's go to the second pitfall. Women in newly independent and still colonized countries saw a common goal in fighting imperialism. They focused their efforts to address gendered power imbalances in their quest for respect of human rights and nationalist goals. This worldwide movement towards decolonization asserted the drive for women's enfranchisement as universal suffrage and nationhood became the goal for activists. A Pan-African awareness and global recognition of Blackness as a unifying point for struggle led to a recognition by numerous marginalized groups that there was potential to politicize their oppression. So in their attempt to influence these newly independent countries to align with the United States, the polarized Cold War climate, racism in the US policy became a stumbling block to the foreign policy objective to become the dominant superpower. So Black leaders were aware of the favorable climate for securing change and pushed forward the civil rights movement to address racial inequalities. They sought to eliminate the damage of oppression using liberation theory and a movement which sought to create societal transformation in the way people thought about others by infusing the disenfranchised with political power to change the power structures. So instead of just moving straight away with a certain group's conception of women liberation, at least in the US, they find that the Black Power movement has sort of modified or hijacked the women's leave movement and inserted the Black Power movement. So as it went, the Black Power movement and global student movement protested the apparent double standards of the age and the authoritarian nature of social institutions. Okay, let me cut through that so that I can go to the third pitfall of the WLM. The philosophy practiced by liberationists assume a global sisterhood of support working to eliminate the inequality without acknowledging that women were not united. Other factors such as age, class, ethnicity, and opportunity, or lack thereof, created spheres wherein women's interests diverged and some women felt underrepresented by the WLM. While many women gained an awareness of how sexism permeated their lives, they did not become radicalized and were uninterested in overthrowing society. They made changes in their lives to address their individual needs and social arrangements, but were unwilling to take action on issues that might threaten their socio-economic status. Pitfall number 4, liberationist theory also failed to recognize a fundamental difference in oppression. Combating sexism had an internal component whereby one could change the basic power structures within family units and personal spheres to eliminate the inequality. Class struggle and the fight against racism are solely external challenges requiring public action to eradicate inequality. The fifth one is that there was criticism of the movement, not only from factions within the movement itself, but from outsiders, like the Playboy founder, who launched a campaign to expose all the highly irrational, emotional, cookie trends of feminism in an effort to tear apart feminist ideas that were, quote, unalterably opposed to the romantic boy-girl society promoted by his magazine. So women's libers were widely characterized as men haters who viewed men as enemies, advocated for all women societies, and encouraged women to leave their families behind. So there was this semanticists who argued that in general, men were not oppressors of women either. Instead, social constructs and the difficulty of removing systems which had long served their purpose exploited both men and women. Women's liberationists acknowledge that patriarchy affects both men and women, with the former receiving many privileges from it, but focus on the impact of systemic sexism and misogyny on women throughout the world. I still have pitfall number 6. There were these discriminations or lack of equality experienced by women of color, women who did not speak English or spoke it as a second language. Sexism had little to do with the ability to protect herself or utilize existing system. So some did not see the intrinsic connection between the liberation of women and the liberation of men that was advocated by the WLM, and felt that feminists did not care about the inequality suffered by men. They felt that the liberation of women without the liberation of men from policies that keep men of color from obtaining jobs and limit their civil rights, further preventing them from being able to protect their families, neither improve humanity as a whole, nor improve the plight experienced by families. Finally, for WLM, there's this gender identity issue. Many lesbians saw commonalities with WLM through the goals of liberation from sex-based oppression, which indulged fighting against homophobia, and others believe that the focus was too narrow to confront the issues they face. While many liberationists rejected the performance of femininity as positive behavior, which meant that white lesbians who actively choose to perform femininity had to decide between their desire to be feminine presenting and their rejection of sexual objectification. Okay, that's about women lib movement, which proceeded after the suffragette wave. Now we go to see what happened after the period of women's lib. And there is the third wave feminism. And we can categorize it as development models for women. So since the days of women liberation movement, the West has developed and contributed advanced theoretical works on improving the position of women in the development of societies. First, we were introduced to women in development, short form as WID. Women in development is an approach of development projects that emerged in the 1960s, calling for treatment of women's issues in development projects. It is the integration of women into the global economies by improving their status and assisting in total development. Women often did more than half the agricultural work, in one case as much as 80%, and that they also played an important role in trade. Women were severely underemployed, yet they may constituted nearly half of the population, but only 13% were recognized as having economic activity. Women were excluded from many types of formal jobs. So many of the female workforce was engaged in the unorganized sector employed in agriculture, agroforestry, fishery, handicrafts, and so on, which are not formally recognized in formal documentation. So with growing awareness of women issues in the 1970s, development planners began to try to integrate women better into their projects to make them more productive. The WID approach initially accepted existing social structures in the recipient country and looked at how to better integrate women into existing development initiatives. The straightforward goal was to increase the productivity and earnings of women. So let me go straight to the pitfalls of the WID model. The validity of the basic assumptions of the WID approach have been criticized by some, while others consider that it does not go far enough. The latter group says it ignores the larger social processes that affect women's lives and their reproductive roles. The approach does not address the root causes of gender inequalities. The WID movement had, in some cases, the unwanted consequences of depicting women as a unit whose claims are conditional on its productive value.
We have 5 minutes more, Prof.
Pardon?
We have 5 minutes more.
Oh, okay. Associating increased female status with the value of cash income in women's life. Okay, since I don't have much time, I will go to what came next after the WID is the WAD model, which is women and development. Women and development, WAD, is a theoretical and practical approach to development. It was introduced into gender studies scholarship in the second half of the 1970s, following its origins, which can be traced to the First World Conference on Women in Mexico City in 1975, organized by the UN. So what arose out of a shift in thinking about women's role in development and concerns about the explanatory limitations of modernization theory. So new ideas suggested that development was only made possible by the involvement of women, and rather than being simply passive recipients of development aid, they should be actively involved in development projects. So WAD took this thinking a step further and suggested that women always been an integral part of development and did not suddenly appear in the 1970s as a result of exogenous development efforts. Okay, let me go straight to the pitfall of the WAD model. Some of the common critics of the WAD approach include concerns that the development projects struggle or ultimately fail due to their scale and the marginalized status of these women. Furthermore, the WAD perspective suffers from a tendency to women as a class and pay little attention to the differences among women, such as feminist concept of intersectionality, including race and ethnicities, and prescribed development and endeavors that may only serve to address the needs of a particular group. WAD has also been criticized for its singular preoccupation with the productive side of women's work, while it ignores the reproductive aspect of women's work and lives. So WAD or the same with WID intervention strategies have tended to concentrate on the development of income-generating activities without taking into account the time burdens that such strategies place on women. Value is placed on income-generating activities, and none is ascribed to social and cultural reproduction. Okay, we come to the last model of women for development for women, which is the GAD, the gender and development. So after shortcomings of one approach and the shortcomings of the succeeding approach, then they develop another approach. So in GAD focuses on the socially constructed differences between men and women, the need to challenge existing gender roles and relations, and the creation and effects of class differences on development. So it becomes popular in the 80s. GAD departs from WID, which discussed women's subordination and lack of inclusion in discussions of international development without examining broader systems of gender relations. GAD challenged the WID focus on women as an important target group and untapped resources for development. It marked a shift in thinking about the need to understand how women and men are socially constructed and how those constructions are powerfully reinforced by the social activities that both define and are defined by them. Okay, unfortunately, we still have things to say against the GAD model. GAD has been criticized for emphasizing the social differences between men and women while neglecting the bonds between them, and also the potential for changes in roles. Another criticism is that GAD does not dig deeply enough into social relations, and so may not explain how these relations can undermine programs directed at women. It also does not uncover the types of trade-offs that women are prepared to make for the sake of achieving their ideals of marriage or motherhood. There are a few criticisms, like a slippage in reality, where gender mainstreaming is often based in the single normative perspective as synonymous to women. Development agencies still advance gender transformation to mean economic betterment for women. The obsession is with economic. Okay, since I only have 1 minute, I suppose, let me straight away go to the conclusions. Thank you for your patience so far. The pitfalls of the concept of gender equality in the Western model may be said, like I said earlier, to have arisen from its inability to benefit from a revealed scriptural guidance. By that, we mean that the Western or secular models have got to rely entirely on human or societal notions of what constitute women's status, their rights and responsibilities, which can be anything other than absolute. This can be seen in the suffrage movement, in the women lib movement, and the WID, WAD, and GAD models of development and empowerment, which I have strived to explain to you. Similarly, the more formal conception of gender equality as envisaged by Western organizations have had several shifts in their conception and measures of gender equality and empowerment, reflecting the relativity and trial and error features of a solely human enterprise. That's how I see it. This is different from the Islamic concept of gender equity, which benefits from prescriptions in the Quran and the Prophet's hadith. The latter does not necessarily mean that there have been no transgression of the revealed scriptural guidance due to human weakness, but that whenever divergences or transgressions occur, the Muslim community is bound to refer back to what the Quran and Hadith say. Thus, gender equality and empowerment means the restoration of the women's God-given status, rights, and responsibilities, rather than the endless and unguided exploration of their status, rights, and responsibilities based on pure human thinking and judgment. I thank you so much for your patience.